Hello friends, welcome back to another edition of the Lovecast with Jamal podcast. I'm so glad you're here tuning in to this episode, whether you're listening to this on more of a traditional podcast venue like iTunes or Spotify, or maybe you're watching this here on YouTube. I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. Just hit subscribe. We've been growing a lot recently on the YouTube channel, and would love for you to subscribe and hit the like button. If you're listening to this on iTunes or Apple iTunes or Spotify, please rate and review this podcast. It really helps us. But I want to take a few minutes to talk about something. I'm not going to take very long today to talk to you, but I do want to talk to you about something that I'm really passionate about, and that's something that's so important. And it's this thing called the Pygmalion Effect. Do you know what that is? Do you know what the Pygmalion Effect is? Well, you may not have heard of the term, but you probably know the concept. It's a very powerful concept. What is the Pygmalion Effect? Well, the Pygmalion Effect is a well-known psychological phenomena that's been studied a lot over the course of history, and it's a phenomena that basically talks about or illustrates how our view of another person or group of people actually influences how they see themselves. Now let me repeat that again. The Pygmalion Effect is a psychological phenomena that studies or kind of talks about the mechanism, or how it is that how we view another person, another group of people, actually affects and alters the way they see themselves. And then what happens is, because they see themselves in a certain way, they then begin to behave in a certain way towards you that reinforces your original belief or idea or thought of them. Isn't that crazy? It's a fascinating phenomena. We as human beings are fascinating creatures, but basically we're very powerful. How we see another person, how we view another person, will determine literally their identity of themselves, which will then influence their actions, which will then in turn reinforce our original view of them. So let me give you an illustration of like how this happened in my own personal life, right? Now, I grew up in a family where there's a lot of dynamics, but basically speaking, my dad had certain views of our culture. My dad comes from, overseas and didn't grow up in the United States, and had a certain view of, Western culture. And so when I got to be in my teenage years, my dad he had a certain narrative, and I don't know if it was conscious. Now, I'm not here to throw any shade. My dad loved me and did the best he could, and absolutely. But he had a certain view of how he saw myself. Right, he saw me through a certain lens, and I know this because he would talk about it a lot. He would talk about how we're just, we don't understand. We're kind of spoiled. We're Western. We're not living up to our potential. We're, all these different kinds of things. That at the time I was not doing well in school. I was being pretty rebellious, getting into a lot of trouble. So obviously he would make these statements that, we're bad kids. Basically, in a nutshell, we're unruly. I think he used that word a lot. He said, "You're an unruly teenager. You're unruly," right? And he would talk about that a lot. He would see, but more importantly, he saw me through those lens of being unruly. Now, I gave him a lot of reasons to have that view, and so seemingly he had every reason to support that view, to believe that view, because I gave him a lot of evidence for that. Okay, but I'll never forget it. Probably my second year in high school, I had a teacher, and I didn't know her. There was hundreds of kids, hundreds of kids in my school. And I remember it was a public school, and I was walking down a hallway in between classes. There was hundreds of kids in the hallway. And out of the blue, I heard somebody call my name. They were like, "Givenchy." Yeah, that's my last name. "Givenchy." And I was like, who's calling my name? And I turn around and I see this teacher. And she's standing in the middle of the hallway full of the kids everywhere. And she's like zeroed in on me. And she's calling my name. And I thought, oh my gosh, for sure I'm in trouble. She caught me doing something. But I didn't know. I mean, I knew she was a teacher. I knew her name, but I had no idea how she knew my name. I did not have her for any classes. This was a massive school, so I'm not really sure how she would even know my name. To this day, I don't know how she knew my name. But she called me out of the crowd and by name and told me to come here. She said, come here. So I walked up to her and I'm waiting to get in trouble. And she just looks at me for a moment, and the look on her face was different. It wasn't a look of disapproval. It wasn't a look of, it was actually a look of deep concern and love. And I didn't really fully grasp that in the moment. I just was a little nervous. And she looked at me and she said, I have a question for you. I said, okay, what's the question? And she said, I've been thinking about this question, and it's been racking my brain, and I just thought there's probably not a better person to ask than you. So I figured I would ask you. And I'm like, what's the question? What's she going to ask me here? You know, no one's ever really addressed me or talked to me like that. And she just looked at me and she goes, what's to become of you? What's to become of you? And you know, that might sound like a harsh question, but it was a question. It was a profound question, because she asked me that question with a ton of concern, and almost like I could tell that she was viewing me as somebody with a lot of potential. I could tell she saw me as somebody with a lot of potential. Almost like, I want to see you thrive and succeed. That's kind of how she was looking at me. And I was hanging around with some kids who were into some pretty negative, harmful things. And so I'm sure that's why she was concerned. But she took the time to notice me, to see me. And she saw me through this lens of almost like, I see your potential. And I didn't even know how to answer the question. No one had ever seen me or looked at me like that, not to my knowledge. No one had looked at me with a sense of like, I see you, and I appreciate what I see, and I so value what I see, and I want to kind of call you into that. No one had ever done that for me up until that point. And a long story short, it changed my whole life. From that day on, something woke up inside of me. And I started to consider myself and to think about my potential, what I could do with my life, it just woke something up in me. So the next year, I didn't drop out of school. I was on the verge of dropping out before she asked the question. I stayed in school. The next year, I ended up finding out what class she taught, and I took her class. I signed up for her class. She actually taught French, which I love for the French language today. And I'm definitely not fluent, but it's something that I do speak it and can get around. And to this day, I love the French language and still study it for that very reason. And I say that because, see, she saw me a certain way, and it actually affected the way I saw myself. And it caused a certain set of behaviors that actually matched how she saw me. She saw me as somebody with a lot of potential when I had nothing to show for it, when I was actually getting into a lot of trouble and on my way to a no good end, basically. She saw me as somebody with tremendous potential, and it was her view of me that changed how I started to see myself, which then reinforced my behavior in a different, it changed my behavior, which reinforced her opinion of me, which was that I was somebody who was intelligent and bright and had a lot of potential. Now, I've mentioned my dad. He saw me as an unruly teenager, and that affected how I viewed myself, and it also informed my behavior to reinforce how he viewed me. Now, that doesn't absolve me of taking radical responsibility for my life. No, our life is our making. It's always our making. We can't blame people for how they see us. But until the reason I'm bringing this up is because how we see another person is so powerful. Until they get conscious of how they see themselves, our job is to see people accurately. Now you might say, well, what if they're really not a good person? Or what if they're not, isn't that just honest? And that's a great question. It's a really important question. Because I'm convinced, and this is probably a different conversation. I used to be a corrections officer. I worked in a prison for 5 years. And I always tell people, after my 5 years working in a prison, before I went into the prison, I used to believe that some people were just evil and bad and just, defective, so to speak. But people were just sinful and evil. That was my belief before I worked in the prison. After I worked in the prison, after being there for 5 years and seeing people at their worst, what got installed in me and in my spirit, deep in my being, was that people are inherently good. Perfect, actually. I know that's crazy, right? Because how could I come to the conclusion working in a prison when you see people commit such acts of violence and evil? Well, because I saw the roots of pain and evil in it, and those roots had nothing to do with them. It had to do with their story. It had to do with generational trauma. But who they were beyond their story was an image and likeness of the divine. Now, you may not believe that. My understanding is that all human beings are made in the image and likeness of what we would call God. I like to use the word divine because the word God has been corrupted. But the image and likeness of the source of all of creation, all human beings are the image and likeness. And this source is deeply good. This source is pure love, actually. And that is everyone's true nature beyond the story. I saw that in the prison. Now, why is this so relevant or important? Now, we're coming up on election season here in the United States, and you really see people, just the vitriol, the fighting, the debates, the tearing down of one side versus the other. You see it a lot. And I always say this, okay? How we see other people, other groups, is, first of all, it's a mirror of how we see ourselves. And it's really important that we see people accurately. But I see it all the time. Now, I'm going to give you an example of the Pygmalion Effect, right? When it comes to politics, okay? This isn't a political podcast. I'm not taking a side here, or, that's a whole other it's a different conversation. But I want to talk about, we typically, the common divisions, at least politically speaking, in the United States, tend to fall on ideological or party lines, right? So you hear a lot about progressives, sometimes called liberals, and then you hear a lot about, conservatives. Now, as far as political branding and political parties go, it's not quite as accurate, but Democrats would tend to align more with progressives and liberals, and Republicans would tend to align more with what would be considered conservatives. But even within those groups, there's a wide spectrum. So I don't want to kind of get into the labels of that, but just and I don't like labels because they dehumanize people, because there's no such thing as a progressive human being or a conservative human being. We're talking about belief systems, right? People are people. Human beings are human beings. Everybody's human, just as human as the other, right? But for conversation's sake, let's talk about this for a moment, if we can, right? Progressives, people who identify as progressive, tend to, and this is just for example's sake, I could use a lot of different analogies, but I'm just using this one to kind of express my point here, okay? So you have progressives here in this country, and progressives tend to, when it comes to this one issue about social programs or the state's use of taxpayer money to support the underprivileged, right? Progressives tend to favor programs, governmental programs that are aimed towards assisting underprivileged people, folks in the lower economic class in this country, programs that are aimed to assist them. Progressives are in favor of a lot of those programs, okay? And conservatives tend to not be in favor of those programs. Conservatives tend to oppose government spending to help folks in a lower economic bracket or minority folks that are underprivileged or underserved, okay? So now progressives will react. I'm just talking about this one area. There's a million different issues we could talk about. Progressives will tend to react against conservatives. They'll see a conservative and they will be so vitriolic towards them a lot of times. They call, I mean, you hear it all the time. Oh, these are uncaring people. These are greedy people. They don't care about the poor. They're all they care about is money and profits. They are, if they're using spiritual language, they'll say they're unchristlike. Jesus cared about the poor. These folks are hypocrites. They don't care about the poor. And it's just a lot of vitriol, right? And on the flip side of that, conservatives react against progressives by calling them socialist or communist, and they're they pander to the victims. They encourage people in their powerlessness, and there's just a lot of vitriol. And these two groups are just kind of going at odds with each other, okay? But I'm here to tell you that they're actually energetic mirrors of each other. Conservatives and progressives are actually fundamentally of the same energetic frequency. They're not different. And the reason they react to each other is because they're like each other. So what do you do with that, right? What do you do with that? Now, I'm not talking about whether you agree or disagree with these policies or positions. It's what do you do with another group you're looking at and reacting to, right? Because remember the Pygmalion Effect. How you see them will determine how they see themselves, which will then reinforce their behavior towards you, which will then reinforce your belief about them. And then we stay at odds. We stay divided. And as a nation, we cannot, I'm just here to tell you that as a nation, there is no path forward in division. There's no path forward in division in your own household, in your own family. But people think that to heal a division, everyone has to agree. No, that's false. You can have unity in a society. You can have unity in a family. And you can still disagree and have different opinions and different belief systems. You can totally do that. So what does it take to unify? Well, you have to heal, right? You have to heal the way you're seeing yourself and the way you're seeing another person. So for example, what's the solution here in this divide between progressives and conservatives? Well, let's use this one specific analogy here, right? About social programs. Let's see just a perfect example of this. So let me tell you about how I have went about this, okay? First thing you do, there's two things that need to happen when there's division. Two things that need to happen. And when these two things happen, you will find unity and healing. I didn't say agreement. You still may disagree with another group or another person's opinion or belief about something. That's okay. But if you can do these two things, you will have moved into an entirely new dimension of healing. So here's the two things, okay? When you're reacting to another group that you disagree with, the first thing you need to do is learn how to see them and appreciate what you see. Find something that you can appreciate about them. So for example, for me personally, if I'm looking at a progressive, somebody who aligns with a progressive political viewpoint, they're in favor of social programs, government programs to help underserved communities. First thing I want to do is there anything about that I can appreciate? Maybe I would agree with that. Maybe I don't agree with that. I'm not even getting into that. The first thing for me to do is I want to appreciate them. Somebody who's aligned with that viewpoint, I want to see something I can appreciate. And it doesn't matter what the group is, how much you may agree or disagree with them, you can always find something that you appreciate about them. Because everybody you meet is a mirror of you in some way, shape, or form. It's a fact. Now we could talk more about that. It's probably a whole different conversation. But for this conversation's sake, I'm looking at a progressive person who is in favor of creating social programs, helping the underserved, helping folks who are in lower socioeconomic bracket, whatever the programs may be. I want to look at those folks and I'm going to say, here's what I appreciate about them. I appreciate the fact that they care about people, that they don't want people to be left in the cracks, that they want people to do well, that they want to help those who are often forgotten about in society. I appreciate their generosity. Folks who tend to be aligned with politically progressive tend to be very, very caring, empathetic, and generous people. I appreciate it. I appreciate that about them. Now let's go to the other side. Let's look at conservative folks. conservative folks have a real, they're not in favor of government programs or social programs, not because they're evil and mean, but because they actually have a emphasis in the way they view people. They have an emphasis on, they really see people as being capable. And they have this understanding that if you just hand people a fish, they won't learn how to fish. That will keep them it'll keep them stunted in their growth and their development. So a lot of conservatives really feel like people are capable and need to be encouraged to become entrepreneurs, to get educated, to develop skill sets, whatever it may be, so that they can do well with their own life. And they feel like if you just throw money at them, then that won't happen. So they really appreciate the human potential, and they really have a view of the possibilities of what people can do. They don't believe that people are inherently victims. They help call people upward. I mean, there's a lot of conservatives, and they really prize entrepreneurship. And I so appreciate that about conservatives as well. I appreciate that about them. I appreciate progressives because they are concerned and they're generous, and they are concerned about those who've been lost and forgotten and maybe don't have the skill sets to make it for themselves. I appreciate that about both groups, right? So that's my job. Number one, appreciate the group that I'm looking at. Number two, and this is probably the most difficult, the most important. The second thing I am here to do, when somebody is living in a way that I don't agree with, or I think is unhelpful, or is even harmful, or offensive in some way, my job, the second component to this, and this is my job, is to look behind the hood, so to speak, and have deep compassion and understanding for what I'm seeing there. Not judgment, understanding. Now let me give you an example of this, okay? Progressives are afraid. They have a lot of fear, right? And I'm just talking about this specific, going back to the same issue I've been talking about in this podcast. Progressives have a lot of fear that people will get left in the cracks, that people will be impoverished, that society will not take care of them, that there's no safety nets for folks. Progressives that really have a fear that there is no safety nets for people, and people will starve, they'll become homeless, they won't have what they need to survive, and there's a real fear of that. So I can see that. I can have a compassion for them on that. Conservatives, on the other hand, oppose a lot of social welfare programs. Why? Because they will say it. We can't just give everybody money. We can't just give a handout to everybody, because if we just simply encourage people to not work, if we encourage people to sit home and collect checks, there's not going to be enough resources. Like if we adopt a socialist way of living in this country, we've seen what happens, right? We've seen what happens in the other countries. The economic system collapses. What is possible? If all the money is just taken from those who have means and are given to those with nothing, then it brings everybody's lifestyle and cost of and standard of living down. And ultimately, if we keep doing that, we'll have economic collapse and we won't have enough to live ourselves. We will be impoverished ourselves. This is a common, I know it's kind of a broad brush way of saying this, but a lot of conservatives, a lot of folks who oppose, government programs to aid the poor will come from that. And this is true also in immigration, but they come from that. Like, we will run out of resources ourselves and we will all be impoverished, right? That's the fear. Interestingly, can you see this? It's the same fear, both on the progressive side and on the conservative side. It's fear of poverty. Fear of not being able to survive. It's the same fear. So what do I do? So here's a question for you. I don't care what side of the fence you may be on. Maybe you identify as a progressive. Maybe you identify as a conservative. Doesn't matter. Has that ever been a concern for you? Not having enough money, not having enough resources to be able to survive. Hasn't that been a concern for you? Yes, of course it has, if you're being honest. This is a common fear that human beings have, not being able to survive. So I can look at a conservative and I can appreciate a conservative person, a conservative person's or conservative viewpoint that wants to encourage people to step into their creativity, step into their power, and to create a life for themselves and not just receive handouts. I can appreciate that about them. And I can also appreciate a progressive's care and loving heart that doesn't want people to get left in the cracks and that wants people to be assisted. I can appreciate that. And I can also see the flip side of it, the fear that progressives are afraid that people will get left in the cracks. And I can also see the conservatives that are afraid that all of our standard of living will be brought down and our way of life will be brought down and everyone will be impoverished, as has happened in other countries that have embraced more of the socialistic or communist model of society. I can understand those concerns on both sides and hold compassionate space for those concerns, because I too, that's also a mirror of my own concern, right? That's a mirror of my own concern. Do you see does this make sense? So there's no room for judgment. There's just room for appreciation. That's the first step. And the second step is deep understanding of the concern. This leads to integration. This leads to integration. Doesn't mean I agree with a conservative viewpoint or a progressive viewpoint. That we haven't even talked about that. I may have my own personal beliefs and I may align with one group more than the other group. Okay, that's fine. But I'm not talking about that. Our job in this society is to integrate, not to divide, to integrate. It's our job as individual human beings to integrate within ourselves. It's also our job to integrate in society, not to judge and tear down and divide. So how do we do this? How do we integrate? Two ways: appreciation and understanding. Because you're going to see people that you disagree with. You're going to see groups and folks that have beliefs and ideas that you can see they're coming from fear, right? That's okay. Your job isn't to agree with them. It's not to disagree with them. It's to understand and see the root of that in yourself and appreciate that in yourself, to hold space for that in yourself, compassionate space. And if there's something you see in that group that you also love and can honor and appreciate it, because how you see them will affect how they see themselves. And don't we want all people, I don't care what side of the political aisle or what their classification is, it doesn't matter. Don't you want all people to see themselves through this lens of goodness, through this lens of love and appreciation? Isn't that what we want? Isn't that what you want for your children? Don't you want your children to see themselves as inherently worthy, as inherently, a human being worthy of dignity and honor? Don't we want all people to feel that way about themselves? Of course we do. Because when we see people as being inherently worthy and valuable, not that we agree, we may completely disagree with them, that's okay. When we see people who are inherently worth dignity and worth celebrating, and when we see people as worthy, that affects how they see themselves, which will then in turn affect their behavior. Doesn't that matter? Of course it matters. Don't you want to be an agent of healing in this society? Of course. Of course you do. Of course we do. We're going to have to go beyond seeing people, right, through the lens of disagreement and judging and labeling and reacting, right? Because it's our mirror we're reacting to. If you don't have to agree, right? You don't have to agree. But if you're reacting, if there's a sense of resistance towards a human being, a group of people, it's because they are mirroring something back to you. And your job is to see something, number one, that you appreciate about them, and number two, something that you can deeply, even if it's coming from a sense of fear in them or brokenness, have some understanding, because that same thing that you see as being broken or wrong in the other person is mirroring something back of yourself. So find that root in yourself and hold space, compassionate space for that in yourself, because you have felt the same fear. And when you do that, you have no room to judge another person, another group that you disagree with. You just hold understanding for them and integration happens. Ultimately, though, the Pygmalion Effect is an indicator of how powerful you are as a human being. And it's really how we create change in other people and in our society. As a life coach, one of my main jobs, I don't say this out loud, but my main job as a life coach is to see the folks I work with in the highest regard. I see the people I work with and I have such respect for them. I'm their coach, but I respect them. I see them as being incredibly powerful, incredibly capable, incredibly good. Doesn't matter what the issues are they're going through. They are powerful, they are good, they are capable. And when I see them that way, I can appreciate things about them. I can also see things that may be unhealed, that may be traumatic, maybe are coming from a lot of pain, but I then see that same root in myself, and I hold compassionate space and understanding for myself in that, and I extend that same understanding to them. And therefore there's healing. Healing is a result of that. I hope this makes sense, but this is our work in the world, right? This election season, when everybody's kind of at each other's throats and everyone's going at it and disagreeing with each other. It's okay to disagree, but at the end of the day, your job is to see them through the lens of yourself. Appreciate something about them that's in you, because they're your mirror, and have compassionate understanding for what may be broken or damaged in them that you see, because that's also in you. Then we will stop reacting to people. We'll start seeing them accurately. This will heal people. I hope this has been helpful for you. I'd love to hear your feedback on this. I'd love to hear some thoughts, ideas, concerns, questions about this very, very topic. I hope you walk away from this podcast with a very clear understanding of the Pygmalion Effect, and understand that how you see people will directly influence how they see themselves, which will directly influence their behavior. So let's embrace this power that we all have this year. Send me your comments, your thoughts, your concerns, your disagreements, your pushbacks even. You can always go to my website, jamaljavanji.com. My email or contact is there on the website. You can contact me there through the site. If you're connected to me on social media, you can always dialogue with me there. But love to hear how this lands with you this year. And there's a lot of great things in store coming up, specifically in regards to my work as a coach. Lots of new things happening I can't wait to tell you about. But until then, I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your week. And until the next episode drops, thank you so much for listening, for your review of this podcast, for rating and reviewing it, liking it on YouTube, whatever it may be. But I really appreciate your guys' involvement there. It makes a huge difference and really helps the show get visibility. But these conversations are important. That's why I've taken the time to create them. And I hope this will be a conversation that you don't quickly forget. Maybe listen to it again, especially as we move throughout this election year. Listen to it again and again. Okay? Until next time, take care.